Sirens flashed against pristine navy dress blues as a decorated war hero found himself shoved against a dusty Chevy. What began as a routine coffee stop off Interstate 95 morphed into a racially charged abuse of power. Officer Greg Jenkins thought he possessed absolute authority. He was disastrously wrong. August heat radiated off the cracked asphalt of a Sunoco gas station just outside Fayetteville, North Carolina. Lieutenant Commander David Carter leaned against the side of his 2018 Chevy Silverado, watching the numbers on the pump tick upward. He was a man composed of quiet intensity, standing 6'2", with broad shoulders that perfectly filled out his crisp Navy service dress blue uniform. Pinned meticulously to his chest were rows of ribbons, culminating in a silver star, and above them, the unmistakable gold trident of a Navy SEAL. David was exhausted, though his impeccable posture betrayed none of it. He had just finished a grueling 48-hour joint command briefing at the nearby Army base, and was navigating the long drive back to Norfolk, Virginia. His mind was on his wife and the quiet weekend they had planned. All he wanted was a full tank of unleaded and a black coffee to keep his eyes open. Across the blistering lot, a county sheriff's cruiser rolled in, its tires crunching over discarded gravel. Behind the wheel sat Officer Greg Jenkins, an 8-year veteran of the force whose personnel file was as thick as a phone book, littered with excessive force complaints and warnings about racial profiling. Beside him was his partner, Officer Stan Miller, an older man counting the days to his pension and notoriously averse to confrontation. Jenkins narrowed his eyes behind aviator sunglasses, locking onto the Silverado and the man standing beside it. To Jenkins, the sight didn't compute. A black man, in a heavily decorated, pristine naval officer's uniform driving a dusty truck with a dented bumper. Jenkins's inherent biases, nurtured by years of unchecked authority and a bitter, cynical worldview, flared instantly. "Look at this guy," Jenkins muttered, shifting the cruiser into park near the convenience store entrance but keeping the engine idling. Stolen valor if I ever saw it. Stan glanced up from his clipboard, squinting through the glare. "Greg, let it go. He's just getting gas. Look at the brass on him, that's an officer." "Yeah, right. Anybody can buy a monkey suit at an Army surplus store, Stan," Jenkins scoffed, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Guy probably uses it to get free donuts and discounts. I'm going to check him out." "Greg, we got a call about a domestic dispute 2 miles down the road," Stan protested weakly. "They can wait," Jenkins snapped, pushing his door open. David heard the heavy thud of the cruiser door and the crunch of boots approaching, but he didn't immediately turn. He calmly unscrewed the gas cap, placed the nozzle back in its cradle, and secured his tank. Only then did he pivot, his expression neutral, sensing the aggressive energy rolling off the approaching officer. "Afternoon, officer," David said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried the natural authority of a man accustomed to leading specialized combat units in hostile territories. Jenkins stopped 3 feet away, his hand resting casually but purposefully on the butt of his service weapon. He looked David up and down, a sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Let me see some ID." David's brow furrowed slightly, a micro-expression of confusion. "Is there a problem, officer? Was I speeding coming off the ramp?" "I didn't ask for a debate," Jenkins barked, stepping closer into David's personal space. "I said, let me see some ID. Now." Years of intense psychological and tactical training kicked in. In places like Ramadi and Fallujah, David had faced down armed insurgents with his heart rate barely cresting 90 beats per minute. A hostile, puffed-up local cop was a nuisance, not a threat. But David knew exactly how easily these situations could spiral. He kept his hands visible, resting them lightly on the rim of his truck bed. "My wallet is in my front left pocket," David stated calmly, telegraphing his movements. "I am going to reach for it now." Slowly, Jenkins warned, his thumb unsnapping the retention strap on his holster. David extracted a slim leather wallet and pulled out his military identification card alongside his Virginia driver's license. He handed them over. Jenkins snatched the cards, barely glancing at the driver's license, his eyes immediately zeroing in on the Department of Defense ID. He held it up to the glaring sun, scratching at the laminated edge with a thick thumbnail as if expecting it to peel away. "Lieutenant Commander," Jenkins read aloud, his tone dripping with thick sarcasm. "Navy SEAL, you really went all out for the costume, didn't you, buddy?" David's jaw tightened. The trident on his chest represented years of blood, sweat, lost brothers, and unimaginable sacrifice. "That is official government identification, officer. If you want to run it, I suggest you call it in." "Oh, I'm going to run it," Jenkins sneered. "I'm going to run it. And when it comes back as a fake printed in some basement, I'm going to lock you up for impersonating a military officer and forging federal documents." "Greg," a hesitant voice called out. Stan had finally emerged from the cruiser, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Just run the plates. Let's not make this a thing." "Shut up, Stan," Jenkins snapped over his shoulder. He turned his attention back to David. "Turn around and put your hands on the truck." David did not move. He stood his ground, towering over Jenkins by a solid 3 inches. "Officer, I have complied with your request for identification. I have committed no traffic violations. I am not under suspicion of any crime. Am I being detained?" "You're being detained for suspected fraud and failure to obey a lawful order," Jenkins yelled, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "Now turn around and put your hands on the truck before I put you on the ground." The atmosphere at the Sunoco station shifted from sweltering lethargy to electric tension. Inside the convenience store, Thomas Wright, a 62-year-old grandfather who had owned the station for 2 decades, stopped wiping down the hot dog roller. He peered through the plate glass window, his stomach dropping. Thomas had an immense respect for the military, and the sight of a decorated officer being berated in his parking lot made his blood boil. He reached for the landline behind the counter, dialing the county sheriff's non-emergency dispatch number. At pump number 4, just 20 feet away, Brenda Cole, a high school history teacher returning from a grocery run, froze with the gas nozzle in her hand. She took one look at Jenkins' aggressive posture and David's calm, restrained demeanor, and her instincts flared. She dropped the nozzle, reached into her purse, and pulled out her smartphone, immediately hitting the bright red record button. "Officer Jenkins," David said, his voice lowering an octave, completely devoid of fear but layered with a stark warning. "I strongly advise you to step back, take a breath, and contact your watch commander. You are crossing a line you will not be able to uncross. Are you threatening a police officer?" Jenkins roared, interpreting David's quiet confidence as a direct challenge to his authority. He lunged forward, grabbing David's left arm, attempting to twist it behind the SEAL's back in a standard pain compliance hold. For a fraction of a second, David's muscle memory overrode his conscious thought. His center of gravity dropped, his right hand twitched, perfectly positioned to strike Jenkins's brachial plexus, a blow that would instantly paralyze the officer's upper body and put him on the asphalt. It would take less than a second to dismantle the man. But David was a professional. He was a leader of men, a representative of the United States Navy, and he knew the optics of a black man striking a white police officer, no matter how justified the self-defense might be. He took a sharp intake of breath, forced his muscles to relax, and allowed Jenkins to torque his arm. "I am not resisting," David announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the woman he could see filming out of the corner of his eye. "I am complying with your physical force. I am a commissioned officer in the United States Navy." "You're a fraud!" Jenkins spat, shoving David hard against the side of the dusty Silverado. The impact drove the breath from David's lungs and scraped the gleaming brass buttons of his dress uniform against the metal. Jenkins yanked a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt and ratcheted them violently onto David's wrists, tightening them until the metal bit sharply into the skin and restricted the blood flow. "Hey, what are you doing?" Brenda Cole shouted, stepping out from behind the shelter of her sedan, her phone held high. "He wasn't doing anything. He was just getting gas." Back up, lady. This is active police business. Back the hell up or you're going in the back of the cruiser, too, Jenkins bellowed, pointing a finger at her while keeping his knee pressed into the back of David's legs. I am recording everything, Brenda yelled back, refusing to retreat. You are assaulting a military officer. I have your badge number. Stan trotted over, looking visibly panicked. He put a hand on Jenkins's shoulder. Greg, Jesus Christ, let up. We got people filming. He's not fighting you. He's a suspect, Jenkins growled. But he eased his knee off David's legs, hauling the SEAL upright by the chain of the handcuffs. David winced as the sharp metal dug deeper, but his face remained a mask of stoic stone. You have no idea what you've just done, David said softly, looking directly into Jenkins's eyes. There was no anger in his gaze, only a cold, chilling certainty. My commanding officer is Vice Admiral Robert Sterling. I am en route to a high-level briefing at Naval Station Norfolk. You have just illegally detained a federal officer. Jenkins laughed, a harsh, nervous sound. The certainty in David's voice, combined with the pristine uniform up close, sent a brief, icy shard of doubt into his gut, but his ego refused to let him back down. Save it for the judge. Fake. Let's go. Jenkins shoved David toward the cruiser. He opened the rear door and roughly forced the lieutenant commander into the cramped back seat, slamming the door shut. Inside the suffocating heat of the patrol car, David adjusted his posture as best he could with his hands bound behind him. He took slow, measured breaths, calming his nervous system. The situation was infuriating, humiliating, and physically painful, but David's mind was already 10 steps ahead. He wasn't thinking about a street fight. He was thinking about a strategic dismantling of a corrupt officer's career. Outside, Jenkins swaggered around to the driver's side, snatching the radio mic from the dashboard. Dispatch, this is Unit 42. I need a flatbed to the Sunoco on Highway 87. Impounding a vehicle. And run a name for me. Carter David. Got him on suspected fraudulent identification and impersonating a military officer. There was a long pause of static. Then, the dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding distinctly confused. Unit 42? Repeat the name? Carter. David. I've got his military ID right here, Jenkins said, reading off the DOD number. Another pause. This one stretched for a full 30 seconds. When the dispatcher returned, the casual tone was entirely gone, replaced by an urgent, sharp professionalism. Unit 42, stand by. Do not proceed. Supervisor is en route to your location. Code 3. Jenkins frowned, glancing at Stan, who had just climbed into the passenger seat and looked positively sick. Dispatch. Why is a supervisor rolling Code 3 for a fraud bust? Unit 42, the dispatcher said, her voice tight. The identification you ran is flagged at the highest federal level. That DOD number belongs to an active duty naval special warfare officer. Sheriff Bradley is personally en route. Do not transport the suspect. I repeat, do not transport. Jenkins stared at the radio, the color rapidly draining from his face. In the back seat, David Carter sat perfectly still, a grim, silent phantom waiting for the storm to hit. The hard karma hadn't just been seeded. It had taken root, and it was about to tear Officer Jenkins' world apart. The silence inside Unit 42 was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the cruiser's air conditioning and the frantic, shallow breathing of Officer Greg Jenkins. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, his eyes darting frantically between the radio console and the rearview mirror. In the reflection, Lieutenant Commander David Carter sat with statuesque stillness, his posture remarkably straight despite the awkward and agonizing angle of his cuffed arms. Greg, Officer Stan Miller whispered, his voice trembling as he stared out the windshield. Greg, uncuff him. Right now. We need to let him go before the sheriff gets here. I can't just let him go, Stan, Jenkins hissed, panic finally piercing his arrogant veneer. I already called it in. If I let him go, it looks like I made a false arrest. You did make a false arrest, Stan shot back, slamming a hand against the dashboard. Did you not hear dispatch? That's an active-duty Navy SEAL! You assaulted a federal officer in broad daylight with a civilian recording the whole thing. Before Jenkins could formulate a defense, the wail of approaching sirens sliced through the heavy August air. It wasn't just one siren, it was a chorale of them. 4 Cumberland County Sheriff's Department SUVs came tearing down Highway 87, kicking up plumes of red dust as they swerved into the Sunoco parking lot. They boxed in Jenkins's cruiser with military precision, their light bars painting the gas station in chaotic flashes of red and blue. Sheriff Thomas Bradley, a 30-year veteran of law enforcement who ran his county with a strict, no-nonsense approach, erupted from the lead vehicle before it even fully stopped. His face was a mask of unadulterated fury. Behind him, 2 state troopers who had been in the vicinity pulled in, securing the perimeter. Jenkins scrambled out of the driver's seat, raising his hands defensively. "Sheriff Bradley, sir, I can explain." "Shut your mouth, Jenkins," Bradley roared, his voice echoing off the metal canopy of the gas station. He didn't even look at the offending officer as he marched directly to the rear door of the cruiser and yanked it open. Sheriff Bradley leaned in, his expression instantly shifting from rage to profound mortification. "Commander Carter, I am Sheriff Bradley. I cannot begin to express my apologies. Turn around, sir. Let's get those off you." David shifted, presenting his back. Bradley fumbled with his own set of keys, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked the steel cuffs. When the metal released, David brought his arms forward slowly, wincing as the blood rushed back into his deeply grooved, bruised wrists. He rubbed the raw skin, his eyes locking onto the sheriff. "Sheriff Bradley," David said, his voice entirely devoid of the panic or relief typical of a released suspect. It was cold, measured, and terrifyingly calm. "I informed your deputy that I was an active duty officer, en route to a secured command briefing at Naval Station Norfolk. He accused me of stolen valor, physically assaulted me, and illegally detained me without probable cause." "I know, Commander." "I know," Bradley said, taking a step back to give the imposing SEAL room to exit the vehicle. "It's a catastrophic failure of procedure. He will be disciplined." David stepped out of the cruiser, towering over the gathered officers. He adjusted his pristine dress blue tunic, brushing away a smudge of dust left by the cruiser's door. "Disciplined is an internal administrative term, Sheriff. What occurred here was a felony, specifically, deprivation of rights under color of law, and assault of a federal officer." Jenkins, standing a few feet away, felt his stomach drop into his boots. "I thought his ID was fake," he blurted out, unable to stop himself. "He was driving a beat-up truck. It didn't make sense." David finally turned his gaze to Jenkins. "My father gave me that truck before he passed away from ALS. I restored it myself. The fact that you assume a black man in a decorated uniform driving an older vehicle must be a criminal speaks to a rot in your character that has no place behind a badge." Sheriff Bradley turned on his heel, his eyes blazing. "Jenkins, hand over your weapon and your badge. Right now." "Sheriff, please." "Now," Bradley bellowed. Trembling, Jenkins unbuckled his duty belt, the heavy leather and steel thudding onto the asphalt. He unpinned his silver star badge and handed it over, his career evaporating in the blistering afternoon sun. "Stan," Bradley barked at the older partner. "Put him in the back of my SUV. He's under arrest for false imprisonment and assault." As Jenkins was perp-walked away by his own partner, David pulled his smartphone from his pocket. "Sheriff, I am contacting the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I am also informing the Pentagon. Due to the nature of my clearance and my current assignment, this is no longer a local matter." Within 20 minutes, the Sunoco station became the focal point of a massive jurisdictional convergence. A black Chevrolet Tahoe with tinted windows arrived, carrying Special Agent Rick Dawson of NCIS out of Camp Lejeune. Dawson took one look at David's bruised wrists and the scuffed buttons on his uniform, and the atmosphere shifted from a local police blunder to a federal crime scene. "Commander," Dawson said, flashing his credentials at Sheriff Bradley, "We'll take it from here." Officer Greg Jenkins thought the worst part of his day was being disarmed and arrested by his own boss. He was vastly underestimating the speed and ruthlessness of the modern digital world. While Jenkins was sitting in a holding cell in downtown Fayetteville, Brenda Cole, the high school history teacher who had filmed the entire interaction, arrived home. Still shaking with adrenaline and outrage, she uploaded the unedited 4-minute video to Twitter and Facebook. She tagged the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department, the U.S. Navy, and several major news outlets. Her caption was simple: "Racist cop assaults and arrests Black Navy SEAL for getting gas. Make him famous." The internet didn't just walk, it sprinted. By 8 p.m., the video had amassed 3 million views. By midnight, it was at 15 million. The footage was undeniably damning. The world watched as a calm, compliant, decorated war hero was verbally abused, physically shoved, and handcuffed by an aggressive, red-faced officer who ignored every protocol in the book. When morning broke, the story was the lead headline on every major national news network. CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC were all running the footage on a continuous loop. The physical damage to Commander Carter's wrists was minor, but the damage to the county's reputation was a catastrophic, bleeding wound. The hard karma hit Jenkins like a freight train loaded with lead. First came the professional annihilation. Under intense national pressure, the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department didn't just fire Jenkins. They expedited his termination process overnight, stripping him of his pension rights due to the commission of a felony while on duty. Then came the federal hammer. Because David Carter was an active duty military officer, the case immediately drew the attention of the Department of Justice. The United States Attorney General, Merrick Garland, briefly referenced the incident in a morning press briefing, stating that the Civil Rights Division would be investigating the matter to the fullest extent of the law. Federal prosecutor Amanda Reyes, a bulldog attorney known for dismantling corrupt police departments, was assigned the case. She didn't just look at the Sunoco incident. She subpoenaed Jenkins's entire personnel file. The thick phone book of excessive force complaints that the department had previously swept under the rug was suddenly exposed to the blinding light of federal scrutiny. Jenkins was formally indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C., Section 242, and assaulting a federal officer. The personal fallout was equally devastating. Jenkins's wife, horrified by the viral video and the sudden, overwhelming onslaught of media parked on their front lawn, packed her bags and took their 2 children to her mother's house in Ohio, filing for divorce 3 weeks later. Jenkins was left sitting alone in a heavily mortgaged house he could no longer afford, watching his life dissolve on national television. To save his own skin and secure his looming retirement, Stan Miller agreed to a plea deal. He turned state's witness, testifying before the grand jury that Jenkins frequently engaged in racial profiling and had explicitly ignored Miller's warnings to de-escalate the situation with Commander Carter. The betrayal by his own partner sealed Jenkins's fate. Meanwhile, David Carter handled the situation with the same stoic grace he had displayed at the gas station. He declined countless offers for exclusive television interviews, issuing only a single, eloquently written statement through the Navy's Public Affairs Office. "The uniform I wear represents the ideals of freedom, justice, and equality that my brothers and sisters in arms have bled to defend. When those entrusted to uphold the law use their badge as a shield for prejudice and abuse, they dishonor not just their community, but the fundamental principles of this nation. I trust the justice system will handle this matter appropriately." The statement went viral, praised by public figures across the political spectrum, including Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro, who personally called David to commend his exemplary bearing under pressure. Behind the scenes, a high-powered civil rights legal team filed a massive civil lawsuit against Cumberland County, citing a systemic failure to discipline a notoriously aggressive officer. The county commissioners, terrified of a public trial that would bankrupt the municipality, scrambled to settle. They offered a staggering $4 million settlement. David Carter accepted the settlement, but the money never touched his personal bank account. In a final, devastating twist of karma that humiliated the corrupt elements of the police force, David transferred every single cent of the $4 million to a foundation that provided legal defense funds for minorities wrongfully accused of crimes, and to the Navy SEAL Foundation to support the families of fallen operators. Jenkins, stripped of his freedom, his family, and his badge, watched the press conference announcing the donation from a small television mounted in the corner of a federal detention center. He had wanted to assert his dominance over a man he deemed inferior. Instead, he had engineered his own total destruction, elevating the very man he tried to humiliate into a national symbol of dignity and resilience. 14 months had passed since the sweltering August afternoon at the Sunoco station. Inside the United States District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina, the air was heavily conditioned, yet the tension in Room 3B was entirely suffocating. Greg Jenkins sat at the defense table, a hollowed-out shell of the swaggering officer he once was. His tailored sheriff's uniform had been permanently replaced by an ill-fitting, off-the-rack gray suit that seemed to swallow his shrinking frame. His face was deeply lined, his eyes darting nervously around the oak-paneled room. He had lost his career, his pension, his wife, and his home. Now, he was fighting to keep his freedom. Across the aisle, seated behind the prosecution table, was Lieutenant Commander David Carter. He wore his service dress whites, the crisp, immaculate fabric starkly contrasting with the somber tones of the courtroom. The silver star and the sealed trident gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He sat perfectly still, a portrait of disciplined endurance, projecting an aura of quiet authority that commanded the absolute respect of the jury. The trial had been a media circus, but federal prosecutor Amanda Reyes kept the jury firmly anchored to the facts. She had meticulously laid out the sequence of events, utilizing Brenda Cole's viral video, Stan Miller's damning testimony regarding Jenkins's history of profiling, and the undeniable physical evidence of the bruising on David's wrists. However, Jenkins's defense attorney, a ruthless, high-priced litigator named Richard Kessler, was not going down without a vicious fight. Kessler's entire strategy hinged on the concept of a reasonable mistake of fact. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Kessler boomed, pacing in front of the jury box. "Officer Jenkins is not a monster. He is a human being who made a procedural error under immense pressure. At the time of this incident, there was an active, internal BOLO, a be on the lookout bulletin circulating in a neighboring jurisdiction regarding a sophisticated fraud ring using forged military credentials to scam local businesses. Officer Jenkins saw a highly decorated uniform, an older vehicle, and a man he did not recognize. He made a split-second, albeit flawed, law enforcement judgment. It was not malice. It was overzealous policing. It was a clever narrative, designed to introduce reasonable doubt regarding the federal civil rights charges, which required the prosecution to prove that Jenkins acted with explicit, willful intent to deprive David of his constitutional rights. Jenkins visibly relaxed at the defense table. Kessler had planted the seed. If the jury believed Jenkins was just an aggressive cop making a legitimate investigative mistake, he might escape the devastating federal prison sentence. But Amanda Reyes was a predator in the courtroom, and she had been patiently waiting to spring a trap that would completely annihilate the defense's fabricated narrative. "The defense claims this was a procedural error driven by a fabricated BOLO," Reyes said, stepping up to the podium, her voice ringing with icy clarity. "They claim Officer Jenkins acted without malice. The United States would like to call our final rebuttal witness, Dr. Simon Hughes, lead audio forensics examiner for the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Jenkins's head snapped up, a cold sweat instantly breaking out on his forehead. Dr. Hughes, a meticulous man with wire-rimmed glasses, took the stand and was sworn in. Reyes walked him through his credentials before bringing up a piece of evidence labeled Exhibit 42B. "Dr. Hughes, can you explain what this exhibit is?" Reyes asked. "Yes," Dr. Hughes replied. "It is the digital audio file extracted from the primary dashcam of Unit 42 the patrol vehicle assigned to the defendant on the day of the incident. When the local department originally reviewed the footage, they believed the interior cabin audio was corrupted and muted prior to the officer exiting the vehicle. And was it corrupted? No, Dr. Hughes stated firmly. It was intentionally manually lowered, but the microphone was still capturing low-frequency sound. Using advanced spectral noise reduction software at the FBI laboratory in Quantico, we were able to isolate and enhance the defendant's voice just seconds before he stepped out of his cruiser to confront Commander Carter. "Your Honor," Kessler shouted, leaping to his feet. "Objection! This evidence is highly prejudicial and was not fully contextualized in discovery." Federal Judge Arthur Henderson, a stern man with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, glared at Kessler. "Overruled, Mr. Kessler. The prosecution submitted the enhanced file last week. You had ample time to review it. Proceed, Miss Reyes." "Dr. Hughes, please play the enhanced audio for the court," Reyes instructed. The courtroom fell into an absolute graveyard silence. From the state-of-the-art speakers mounted on the walls, a hiss of digital static filled the room, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thrumming of a cruiser's idling engine. Then, the unmistakable, sneering voice of Greg Jenkins echoed through the court. "Look at this guy. Stolen valor if I ever saw it." The voice of Stan Miller followed, muffled but clear enough. "Greg, let it go. He's just getting gas. Look at the brass on him, that's an officer." Then came the twist that completely shattered Kessler's defense and stunned the entire courtroom. Jenkins's voice cut back in, dripping with venomous, premeditated racial malice. "Yeah, right. They hand out those ranks like candy now, just to hit their quotas. I'm going to teach this affirmative action fake a lesson about respecting real authority. Watch this." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Brenda Cole, sitting in the second row, covered her mouth. Several jurors physically recoiled, their faces contorting in absolute disgust. At the defense table, Richard Kessler slowly sat down, closing his legal pad. He knew, in that exact second, the case was entirely unwinnable. Jenkins stared blankly ahead, all the blood draining from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. The audio was a death sentence. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that his actions had absolutely nothing to do with a bolo, police procedure, or suspicion of a crime. It was an intentional, racially motivated, premeditated assault under the color of law. The following morning, David Carter was called to the stand. He did not speak with anger or vengeance. Instead, he spoke with the profound, devastating disappointment of a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, only to be betrayed by those sworn to protect his community at home. "When Officer Jenkins placed his hands on me," David testified, his deep voice carrying flawlessly across the silent room, "he did not just violate my physical person. He attempted to strip away my dignity. He looked at the uniform of the United States Navy, a uniform that my friends have died wearing, and he used it as a prop for his own prejudice. I did not fight back physically, because my duty is to de-escalate and to lead by example. But I knew, standing against that truck, that I would fight back with the full weight of the truth." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When the foreman stood to read the verdict, Jenkins had to be physically supported by his attorney to remain standing. "On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant, Gregory Jenkins, guilty. On the count of assault of a federal officer, we find the defendant, guilty." Judge Henderson did not hold back during the sentencing phase. He looked down at Jenkins with a gaze that could have frozen boiling water. "Mr. Jenkins," the judge began, his voice echoing like thunder. "You were given a badge and a gun to be a shield for the vulnerable. Instead, you weaponized your authority to feed your own bigotry. You attempted to humiliate a decorated war hero, and in doing so, you have brought indelible shame upon yourself and the law enforcement community. The karma you face today is entirely of your own making." Judge Henderson brought the heavy wooden gavel down with a violent crack. I sentence you to 96 months, 8 years in a federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting closed around Jenkins's wrists echoed through the courtroom, a stark, poetic reversal of the violence he had inflicted 14 months prior. He was led away by U.S. Marshals, his head bowed, weeping silently as he faced nearly a decade behind bars. 3 weeks later, on a bright, crisp morning at Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek, the atmosphere was a world away from the sterile confines of a federal courtroom. David Carter stood at attention on the parade deck, the ocean breeze snapping the American flag against the blue sky. Vice Admiral Robert Sterling stood before him, holding a pair of gleaming silver eagles. For exceptionally meritorious service, unwavering leadership under pressure, and embodying the highest ideals of the United States Navy. The Admiral read from the official citation. David's wife stepped forward, a proud, tearful smile on her face, and gently pinned the new rank insignia onto his collar. Now a captain, David Carter turned to face the men and women of his command. He had weathered the darkest, most humiliating storm of prejudice, and he had emerged not just victorious, but unbroken. He had proven that while corruption and malice might wield temporary power, they will inevitably shatter against the quiet, unyielding bedrock of true honor. True authority is never born from a badge worn with malice, but from a quiet, unbreakable resolve. Greg Jenkins sought to humiliate a man he deemed beneath him, only to orchestrate his own spectacular ruin. Commander David Carter remained completely unbowed, proving that integrity always outlasts prejudice. In the end, the system worked because truth was captured, exposing shadows and allowing absolute justice to finally take its rightful, unyielding course.